I think for like a lot of fantasy readers and writers, I'm a sort of bit of a student of history, and I think when you kind of read it, and I read a ton of history nonfiction, and I studied it at school, and I very nearly did a degree in history, but my parents, damn them, dissuaded me from it. I love reading about history, and I've always found it really interesting. And I think, and when you do read a lot of history, you get your kind of favorite periods, don't you? And things to read about. And people love to read about like ancient Rome and ancient Greece, or the Second World War, whatever. And for me, I think I always had the Napoleonic Wars was a huge one for me. I loved that. Great Britain versus France, basically, and so that was a big one for me. And I thought, and of course the medieval period. Everybody loves medieval period, and I had the Templars as well. Basically everything you read in my books is where I've taken something from history that I find personally really interesting.
What is up, everybody? You're listening to episode 139 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host, Adrian M. Gibson, and welcome to our weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me this week is my co-host, my bestie from the Midwestie, the queen of my days, Greta Kelly. How you doing, Greta?
I'm good. If I just started, I should have mentioned this before we started filming. I just started lifting weights. So if you see me groaning, I'm in physical pain. Come help me.
MJ's inspired you.
I know. She's a bad influence.
She's such a bad influence. Yeah. It's like anyone want to do exercise.
Yeah. Come join the fitness craze.
Well, if you want to support Greta and her journey of getting buff, then you can go buy her novel, Queen of Days, which is available now in paperback. If you want a fun heist where a chaotic group of people kill gods, then you're in for a good time.
And if you are interested in some speculative mystery, check out Mushroom Blues. It's the fungal noir of your dreams. It's got gritty politics and mushroom people. Why don't I just say there's mushroom people, go buy it?
If you like psychedelics, I got you covered, man. Yeah.
There you go.
And if you like more thieves and heists and all that fun stuff, and you want to support MJ and her getting buff, even though she already is, go pick up Among Thieves and its sequel, Thick Ass Thieves, to give her a little kickback and help her quit her day job. As well, a quick shout out to our newest patrons on Patreon, Stephen Crawford and Gavin Guile. Thank you for supporting the show. Anyone else who wants to support the show, you can check out the links in the description to support our Patreon or merch store. Just give the show a little kickback, help us do what we do here. Also, don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast app, and subscribe to the FanFiAddict YouTube channel, where this and every other episode of the show is available in full video. And now, welcoming to the podcast for the first time, Richard Swan, illustrious author of the Empire of the Wolf trilogy, the Art of War trilogy, and the soon-to-be-released Grave Empire. How are you today, Richard?
Yes, very well, thank you. Yeah, it looks like it's my nighttime here. What time? It looks like it's very much like it's daytime where you are. Where are you? Ecuador, did you say?
Yeah. It's just it's a balmy afternoon here in Ecuador, so.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, no,
it's a balmy afternoon here in the northern part of the United States, too. It's a whole 30 degrees. Yay.
Oh, 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Yeah, you threw me for a second there, because I was like, that's very warm. And then I was like, oh, no, it's not. Wait, okay. I was like, what are you complaining about?
She's got that, yeah. The majority of our listeners are in the U.S. It's like she's got that stupid system.
Right. I know. So if I said it was
Americans,
what is it? It's been about 6 degrees here today. So would that be like sub-zero freezing temperatures? And could you even do that in Fahrenheit? I'm not even sure.
Oh gosh, yeah, it was something. It's something awful.
It's been cold here too.
Google converter, people. All right, well, Richard, just to give folks a little bit more information about you, anyone who isn't familiar with you, your work, if you can tell them about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Richard Swan. I'm an English author. I started in self-published sci-fi many, many years ago, and then I kind of threw in the towel on that after a year or two. And then I got a deal with Orbit to publish a fantasy trilogy in I got the deal in 2020. I think the first book was published in 2022. That was The Justice of Kings, which is the first book of the Empire of the Wolf trilogy. And the third and final book of that trilogy just came out in February last year. And I'm currently about to release it's not really a sequel, it's more of a trilogy set in the same world, but a few centuries after the events of the first trilogy, starting with Grave Empire. And that series is called The Great Silence. And it's sort of a fantastical kind of, flintlock era, gunpowder, muskets, etc. Whereas the first one was much more sort of medieval. And then I've got a few other bits and pieces on a few other irons in the fire. I got a Sci-Fi series coming out, which hasn't been announced yet, but I'm very, very, very excited about that one. I'm excited about all my books, but this one, I don't know what it is about this unannounced. I love them all equally, just like my children. But there's something about this this unannounced series, which is just really tickling my fancy at the moment. So that should be announced in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. And I'm also dipping my toe into some Warhammer 40,000 fiction. So I've got a few irons in the fire. Yeah, been hard at work the last year or two. Yeah, very much so. Yeah, it really is flat out actually, but it's a lovely problem to have.
And I like how you had to we're really excited defend your favorite as your little children. It's like, I swear, I love them all.
Definitely. I love them all the same, though. You'll Orbit, if you're listening.
Before we dig deeper into the episode, a quick word from our sponsor. Welcome to Transference, where death and sickness are but a distant memory. Nicholas Five Boroughs is a sicko, someone that takes on others' illnesses. In a city where diseases can be transferred, the rich buy longer lives without pain, and the poor get a short life of constant sickness. Brought back from the brink of death by his friend Brian Meadowhearth, or maybe the invisible hand of an outside actor, Nick finally gets the chance to try and change things, to finally stop the whole disease transfer network. Tensions escalate as Nick infiltrates a higher society he doesn't understand, and starts to fall for Dorothy Sungate, the very person he needs to manipulate to be successful. And between run-ins with a talking cat, genetically modified humans, and a robotic police force, the world around him just keeps getting stranger. Can Nicholas tear down the disease transfer architecture? And how much of his humanity is he willing to bargain along the way? A dystopian vision of healthcare and a market economy, Transference will appeal to fans of Red Rising, Blade Runner, and the BioShock franchise. Soon to be a complete duology with the release of Transcendence in the summer of 2025. Transference by Ian Patterson is available now in paperback and ebook. Get your copy today. And now, enjoy the rest of this episode of SFF Addicts.
Well, we always like to delve into our guests' nerdy backstories and origins. Are there any books or TV shows or movies that really spawned that love of speculative fiction in you when you were growing up?
There certainly are, yeah. You know what, I answered this, actually, someone else asked me this question recently, and I had to kind of really think about it, because obviously when you're in your kind of, your childhood or your early teens, and there's a kind of big mixture and mass of things that kind of form that really kind of turbocharge your sort of love of genre. And I think when I really drill down into it, I think the turning point was a book called The Ring of Five Dragons by Eric Van Lustbader. And Eric Van Lustbader, I think, wrote quite a few of the Jason Bourne novels. And The Ring of Five Dragons was kind of like a secondary fantasy, but some sort of sci-fi guys landing on a kind of, fantasy world. And it was the first kind of adult fantasy I read, but I must have been quite young at the time. I think I was about 13 or 14. And it was one of those books that I was like, I didn't really understand about a third of what was happening in the book, but because it was all, just totally the secondary world mess of, clash of cultures. But it just it sent me down a little bit of a rabbit hole. And I think that was the kind of the key turning point for me. And then from there, I kind of went into more Peter F. Hamilton, sci-fi like Night's Dawn trilogy and the sort of Confederation. And I was a huge Ian Banks fan as well, Ian M. Banks. Read all of his stuff in my teens. And in terms of other media, I think definitely like the Star Wars prequels, they were massive for me at the time. Like I absolutely love those. I still do, honestly. I know it's not a popular opinion, but man, I love them.
No, but like within a veil of
like
nostalgia,
the mark of a true Star Wars.
Yeah, within a veil of nostalgia, they're great, man.
Yeah,
they're great. They're good movies, I didn't even dislike Jar Jar Binks that much. Everybody seems to hate that guy, but I was like, he's fine in my book. It's always all right, So definitely Star Wars, definitely like video games like Halo and Halo and Halo 2 were massive for me when they came out, and that's the kind of era we're talking about, kind of 2000, early 2000s. All the kind of sci-fi media that was coming out around that time, I think, was the really big, really, and a lot of video games, especially like StarCraft, Siberian Sun, a lot of like RTS, like strategy games, sci-fi strategy games. I used to love that stuff. I think it's funny. I think a lot of inspiration I've drawn for my writing has come from video games as much, if not more, than books in many instances. Like I can point to a lot more video game experiences I've had as a child that kind of informed and impacted my writing, almost more than.
I suppose it's more hands-on. Like you're having an effect on the world.
Yeah,
and it's like,
yeah, that's right.
Gotta be
A lot
of
of it's just the aesthetic as well. I remember I used to be a huge fan of. I had the first PlayStation, and one of my favorite games on the PlayStation was Wipeout.
Oh, dude!
You remember the old racing game? And I actually bought this year a book. It's like a hardback, big, thick hardback, sort of coffee table book. And it's like the origin of Wipeout, like, and it's got all these articles and concept art and like art from the games and everything. Really, really cool book. And in my unannounced sci-fi, which I love, but not as much as all my other books, it's got this kind of like very Wipeout-esque, sport in it as one of the storylines. And I was like, and it's that, and that's what I mean. It's these very old. I haven't played Wipeout for like 2+ decades, but it's still there, in my mind. It's had that incredible effect on my writing. All the different races and the teams and the, so that sort of thing, I guess, would be the what's sort of turbocharged that love of genre.
Turbocharge is a good word in the case of
it's good, though. Yeah.
Look at you. Or like pod racing in the Phantom Menace. It's like,
yeah, love that.
Let's go, man. Let's go.
Love
dude.
it.
Yeah.
Ben Quadranero.
So oh my god, Rich just damn.
I'm in the detail of it. I'm there. I'm in the guts of it.
I'm there. I'm in the canyons, baby. But it sounds like a lot of your influences, like I love that video games played such a huge part in it, and authors like Peter F. Hamilton, Ian Banks. And did that kind of feed into what your self-pub trilogy, your first kind of
definitely, yeah,
break into the writing space with The Art of War? Yeah. Was that very much inspired by the sci-fi that you kind of grew up with?
100%, yeah. So and it was with that it was, and Mass Effect was another one as well. Actually, the first Mass Effect game, which I maintain was the best of the trilogy. Everybody loves the second and the third one, but the true fans of Mass Effect love the first game more than the others. Everybody loves tinkering with a little gun. The little gun details, and this gives you 3% extra on. Anyway, it was more of an RPG, the first one, but that whole aesthetic kind of fed into my Art of War trilogy, and I think a lot of what I did in the Art of War as well was, I kind of grew up, during the War on Terror. I wasn't taking part in it, but it was very much kind of the media saturation. It was in the news. I come from a military family, so my dad spent some time in the Middle East, and so it was very kind of prominent in my world. And I did law at university, and so there was a lot of, when I did things like public international law, or the laws of counterterrorism and things like that, that all really informed the kind of the stuff I was writing. And so it was a mixture of those sci-fi concepts, but also like it's a very much a kind of war on terror, paranoia kind of vibe to it as well. So I was kind of exploring those themes through through the fiction, through the science fiction. So there's a lot of, definitely the first kind of really big melting pot of all the influences that I'd had over the years went into that trilogy. Yeah, got a bit of a soft spot for it, actually. Bit of a soft spot for that trilogy. It's still selling, still going, still selling. People still buying it.
What was your experience like with self-publishing? Was it a good experience? Was it surprisingly difficult for you? And why did you decide to make the jump over to
That's an excellent question. I think so my experience of it, I went into it pretty naive, I think, and I think we're talking like 2015, so almost a decade ago now.
Totally different landscape, yeah.
Totally different, to what it is now. We're still talking in the days of like Create Space, print on demand. And there was not this kind of cottage industry of freelance editors and proofreaders and cover designers and artists that exists now. There's a whole ecosystem of creatives that do this for a living. There's money to be made, and back then it was much more kind of bitty, but much more kind of like I'm going out and speaking to like random people on like DeviantArt and commissioning covers and stuff like that. So it was much more kind of hands-on, pulling stuff together, all totally by yourself. And I looked back at my old kind of like Twitter. I created a Twitter account, and I was just going to post. And I was like, I've got to market these books. And I sort of went on Twitter, and I was posting stuff, and I fell prey to like a sort of classic scam, which was like, pay us £5 and we'll promote your book to our 10,000 followers. And of course, like, there are 10,000 bots, and it's all just they're just basically stealing your money. And it's that kind of thing. So it's very naive about the whole thing.
Unfortunately.
Oh, massively! I still get solicited by those all the time.
Yeah.
And the numbers go up and up. So they're like, oh, we've got 50,000 followers. I was like, I know some really popular booktubers, and they do not have anything like that number of followers. That is not a realistic number, guys. So what, it was an interesting experience, and I actually as with most self-published projects, it didn't sell a dramatic number of copies. I think when I gave it away for free, I got a ton of downloads, in the thousands, but in terms of sales, they were fairly low. And I did all of the stuff that you're told to do with it, like you got to put yourself out there, you got to market, you got to do the social media aspect of it and things like that. And I did all of that, and it did fairly well. I'd say maybe 10,000 copies or something over the couple of years that I did it, but it kind of started petering out, and I did, and I didn't have the time and the energy to market it. And I think so much of it just comes down to marketing, and that's not just self-pub, that's all publication. It comes down to marketing. And so I was like, well, I'm working full-time as a lawyer. I can't spend, hours of every day, and money as well, right? You got to spend. Some of the guys now, they're spending thousands. I mean, honestly, like 6 figures annually on marketing. I was like, I don't have the money for this, man. I don't have the time, and so I just kind of let it slide. I let the book do its own thing. And they inevitably just trended down to zero, and I thought, that's great. You know what, I've done that, I've experienced it. It was fun while it lasted, but and I released a new book. So that trilogy was finished, and I did a new one, and I self-published it, and I was like, yeah, I'm just going to put it out there and see what happens. And what happened was nothing at all. Like it just did literally zero sales. And I was like, yeah, if you just put a book on the internet and nobody knows about it, you won't sell any copies of that book. And I was like, I'm done with that now. Like that was an interesting experience, but I'm very much finished with it. And so I kind of just I went back to my original plan, which was to try and get a kind of Big Five kind of deal, and that ultimately obviously happened. But that's obviously less of a choice. It's more of a, you hope it happens, and eventually, or if it either does or it doesn't happen. But so it's. But I think with those guys and the marketing budgets and the distribution and the reach and everything, it kind of takes all of that away from you're out of your head and your mind, so you can just focus on the writing the stories, which is obviously the fun part. So that was the kind of the journey, but it was it unfolded over about 5 or 6 years, I think, in the end, and 2 very different experiences and industries for sure.
Mm-hmm. And all that while you were working as a lawyer. So tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, you mentioned a little bit about like the kinds of law that you were studying in university, but what kind of path did your law career take?
I originally wanted to be a criminal lawyer, and I trained to be like a kind. You don't have them in America, but in England at least we have things called barristers, which are kind of like your trial attorneys, like a trial.
And it sounds way more badass than anything the United States.
It does.
On the legal front. It's like, what's your job? I'm a barrister.
I'm a barrister, not to be confused with a barista.
No.
But that didn't come off in the end, and I went into litigation, but commercial litigation. So and not on the advocacy side, on the you're sitting in an office side. And so I did commercial litigation for about 10 years in various roles. So I stopped doing a sort of a kind of associate level, and that was obviously in central London. Kind of like classic when you say lawyer, it's kind of like what your first mental image is of, like a guy in a suit in a kind of high rise, doing legal stuff on a computer. That was my job, and so it was obviously disputes, big commercial disputes, multi-million, sometimes multi-billion pound disputes. So a sort of smallish cog in a medium-sized machine at the firm, and long hours, in and out of court, all that good stuff. I did that for about 10 years, and then I was able to kind of start writing full-time about 4 years ago now, which was obviously always the dream. But law was good. Obviously it paid well, and it could be exciting at times, but especially with litigation, people arguing and fighting and things. But it was stressful, and ultimately not very good for your health. Anything that's stressful isn't very good for your health. So it didn't.
Do you think it helped prepare you at all for becoming an author, particularly with the contractual realities of being on the trad side? Do you think it?
I think it's always useful to know. I think knowing the law, and also because I was a commercial litigator, you still academically and professionally you get to know a huge range of law, and also just how the law works generally. So it's a great life skill, and I'm one of those people that are like, reading the contract and all the the phone bills and things. Like, what are you assholes sneaking in here?
You're like one of the few people. Everyone else is just like scroll.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Always read the fine print. So it's great. And I'll be doing. I'll get family members and friends who'll be like, oh, can you help me with this XYZ, or my car windshield broke, and so it's a great skill to have. I think the best thing it did for me for my writing career was, as a fantasy writer, obviously writing, if you're doing a kind of pastiche of a sort of medieval world, and you've written and you spent your professional career writing in this kind of very formal way, I think it really lends itself to that style of writing. So, if you read my Empire of the Wolf series, the writing is quite formal, but in a way that lends itself to the time period that you're reading in. And there's lots of but the other great thing about law is you get a massive vocabulary, because obviously when you're dealing with contracts, you have to try and be as specific as possible about every little thing. And so there's loads of little words and kind of turns of phrase and a little bit of Latin here and there, which all kind of feed into the sort of the verisimilitude of the writing. So I think that's been great. It's almost like a sort of proto-Victorian way of speaking and writing, and especially moving into the kind of gunpowder era, the kind of like 17th, 18th, 19th century kind of era of the Empire of the Wolf. It really lends itself to that style of writing. So in terms of writing style, it's been excellent. In terms of the contractual stuff, I mean, I've got an agent for that, so I'm like, well, I'm not gonna. That's his job. And it is ultimately quite boring. So I'm like, well, it's like, just because I can do it doesn't mean I enjoy it. So
But Richard used to be a lawyer. No, pass. I said pass.
Yeah. Oh, no. There's things behind.
It is true though. Like reading your books, you're one of those authors where I'm like, God damn it, Richard, I have to get a fucking dictionary to read some.
Yeah.
Which is good because it's like,
how dare you
big
make
old
me
words
learn
in there.
things.
There's some big old words.
Which is the benefit of reading on like Kindle, where you can just like,
is there a dictionary functions there?
You can, at least like a Kindle on my iPad, I'm able to just like highlight a single word and an automatic
that's clever.
dictionary window comes up. So I'm like, good, streamline the process.
There it is.
But then when I'm reading your physical books, I have to have an actual dictionary.
Get your dictionary out, you
on
idiot.
My phone.
Or just be cleverer. That's the other option.
I mean, I'll have to settle for a dictionary. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You were gonna. You would have.
That ship is sailed.
Yeah, too many mushrooms. But yeah, it does lend itself really well to your work, and
thanks, man. Yeah,
I think I'm curious to get your take on all these lessons that you've learned, because I mean you've released an entire trilogy, which is an accomplishment in and of itself through trad, and I think there are just like so many lessons that authors can learn at every stage, whether your debut, whether you're going into like your sophomore release, and just kind of every step of the way there's new shit that's dumped onto your doorstep. But what are some of the big lessons that you think you've kind of taken away from your experience in this industry?
I think how slow it is. I think.
But you come from law. It's
I know.
Like even slow for
you.
Man,
those cases rumbled on for years.
And publishing is still slow.
Honestly, it is.
Oh my god, dude.
It's remarkable. I think. Well, the timing actually worked out for me. I've been quite lucky in the timings because when we signed the deal for Empire of the Wolf, they were going to publish it in 2020. I think we missed the boat for a 2021 publication because it was too short. There wasn't enough time to get it ready. And that was great because actually it was COVID that year, and people who released books in that year or debuted in that year, a lot of them just went totally under the radar. Is that you? Was it? Oh no!
Me?
And
MJ,
it's a real shame. All the bookshops were shut. Everybody was at home. And I knew another guy, maybe Nick Martell, I think debuted in 21 as well, and I think he had I don't want to say it didn't ruin anybody's career, but it didn't give it the best start either. And so I was lucky, so I missed it. So in that way, the slowness kind of worked in my favor. But what kind of quite quickly happened, because I started writing full time quite soon after that. I think when we moved to Australia, I started writing full time, and I'm quite a speedy writer anyway, because I've been writing for many years now. So it's a pretty well-oiled machine in my kind of head, and so I can write a book fairly quickly, kind of even in 4 or 5 months. And so I was writing kind of 2-3 books a year, and they were just kind of stacking up, and and they were like, well, you've just got a book out, your first book's out in 2022, so we don't want to be releasing another book and it kind of clashing with that one, and you really want to wait and I was just like, my god, I've got like 5 books on the stocks here, and if you're self-pub, you don't have that problem, you just churn them out. But if you're beholden to a publishing schedule, and they like to do a book a year, right? That's the kind of the spacing that they like, and there are good reasons for that. And so it was kind of glacial pace, and so I had to basically go to find other publishers and get new deals so that books could kind of be published, multiple books a year across different, and then you have to start being careful with that, because there are kind of non-compete clauses, and also you genuinely, if you have like more than say 2 books coming out a year, they do start to take up too much oxygen. You're not getting enough space between the releases to kind of give each one the marketing oxygen it needs. And so I was doing this, and that was good. So the timing was too slow, and I was like, I have too many ideas. I have too many books, and so the timing, and there's nothing you can do about it, really. So I think one thing I would learn is, and you'll get this if you get like a book deal, they'll say, great, we're taking a book for what year is it now? 20. We're buying books for 2027, and you're like, oh my goodness, my. And when I think about it in terms of my kids' ages, I've got 3 books coming out in 2026, right? Some of those books I sold a long time ago, right? Like early last year, and I think like I've got a baby now. My youngest son is a baby. I thought he's going to be like walking and talking by the time that book comes out. Which is just nuts. So the timing, it's very much like the thing I would say to anybody is, it's just slow. Like just and the other and so adjust your expectations, because none of it is fast, and it's slow enough that it just drains all of the excitement out of it as well. So you're like, because you have so long to get used to every stage. So when you've got a book coming out, they're like, oh, here's the cover, and you're like, oh man, that's an awesome cover. And then it's like, and then you get used to the cover over a couple of weeks, and then it's no longer exciting because you're used to it. And everything's got like a several month lead time, and so by the time the book actually comes out, you're just kind of like, yeah, cool. There it is. There it is.
It's a thing. It happened. Whatever.
And oh yeah, that thing that I wrote 2 years ago. Oh yeah, I forgot that was coming out.
Crap! Now I have to talk about it, and I don't remember what I wrote.
Now I have to talk to a bunch of people about it. So I think the timings was the biggest one for me. Was just learning and adjusting and getting used to how slow it all was. And I think I've had a good run. So I haven't really been doing it for 2 or 3 years, but I've been lucky in that everyone I've worked with has been really good, really conscientious, really on it. Excited about my projects and given it the sort of appropriate level of marketing and push, and so it's been great. I've no complaints at all. But there's obviously horror stories all over the place, and I think a lot of people are afraid to, I guess, take a little bit of control of their career as well. I think you definitely are at the mercy of market forces a lot of the time, and I think publishing has become very trend focused and very cyclical. So there was grimdark, and then there was the retellings, the Greek retellings, and now there's the romantasy, and next probably back to grimdark again in a couple of years.
Well, with cozy fantasy, people are like, no, too much cozy. Let's go back.
Yeah,
to the dark shit.
You know what it is, and like, hey, if you're making money out of cozy fantasy, props to you. That's wonderful. It's not for me. I'll never disparage anyone's reading habits or writing habits. If it works for you, it works for you. It's not for me. I need some stakes and some, life or death in my books. But I think people probably thought, this is the way publishing kind of currently works. Oh, Travis Baldry had massive success with Legends and Lattes. Let's go all in on this, and we'll buy like 100 of these books, and then they're being published over the course of 3 or 4 years. And after like 18 months, everyone's kind of like, well, I'm kind of over this now. But the publishing schedule is still another 18 months of that same. And so you'll get guys coming in. I see it now. Like, I feel bad. You get guys coming in, and it's like, oh, this new Greek retelling. And I'm like, oh man, the Greek retelling, that was 2 years ago. You missed a boat on the Greek retellings. We've had that, but you just know that book was bought at the height of the Greek retellings, and so it's you can never write to market. That's the other piece of advice: never write to market, because by the time the market will have moved on by the time you get a foot in the door. The advice always has to be write the book you want to write and make it the best version of that book that you can. And if it's good enough, it'll find a home somewhere. But never write to trends, because you'll miss the boat on them. Inevitably, unless you can write it in like a month, in which case go nuts. But which more power to you. But yeah, I think that'd probably be another piece of advice I'd say. Never write to market. Always just focus on the thing that you want to do.
Well, you mentioned earlier that your latest book is set in the same world as your Empire of the Wolf trilogy. And we'll like dig into that more, I think, in the next episode. But was it really hard for you to say goodbye to Von Volt and Helena?
It wasn't. I think if you kind of speak to a lot of authors, which you guys obviously do, I think what you'll get is people give I loved that trilogy, but I was definitely done with it by the time I'd written the third book. I was ready to kind of leave those characters in that world. I say that, and then I immediately wrote.
And then you have a prequel novel coming out. You're full of shit, Richard.
Yeah, I know. Well, what I was going to say was not Grave Empire. When I finished Trials of Empire, I had a bit of time. I had this weird lag because I turned it in early, months and months before it was due to be turned in. And so I was like, what am I going to do? And so I wrote another book set. It was a sequel to Trials of Empire, but it wasn't Von Volt and Helena. It was Sir Radomir. And it was much more of a kind of law and order type thing, legal thing. And I read about 50, 60,000 words of it. So actually, you know what? I say that, but I am full of shit. I had more stories to tell in that universe. And I think I had this conversation a little while ago because I was at an event with in Australia, obviously Jay Christoph, who is Australian, and so he and I did it for his Empire of the Damned release. He asked me if I wanted to MC his event, which I was obviously delighted to do, and we were having a conversation in front of this big crowd of people who were obviously all there for Jay, and someone said, "Would you ever write more of the Nevernight?" The series, which obviously had been phenomenally successful, and I said, you think you want more Nevernight, but you don't. You want the experience of reading Nevernight for the first time again, and you can't have that experience again. You've read it now; it's already in your head, and inevitably, I think the temptation is to kind of do more and give the readers more and do it. But ultimately, that story is told, and I have said. This is another piece of bullshit because I'm never going to write another Von Volt story, and then I've got a Von Volt novella coming out in October. But it is a prequel, so it doesn't count.
Yeah.
Somehow in my head, that's sort of a bit of a mental contrivance. But I think Helena's story. Okay, this definitely is true. I don't have any plans to write any more of Helena. I think that story is definitely told. I think Von Volt's a bit of a seam to mine, especially in his earlier years, because it's got a nice format, right? The legal investigation, horror, police pursuit. There's a nice format, and there's a bunch of stories that can be told, in that format, and that's great. Like nice little self-contained novellas or short stories or whatever. That's great. But I think the Helena story was such a complete emotional arc that I would be very wary of revisiting that. I think the scope for kind of ruining it would be huge. Sorry, what was the question? Why am I talking about this? What was
no, was it hard to leave it behind?
It
seems like yes.
It wasn't hard to. It was not hard to leave it behind. I felt like I had immersed and existed myself in that world for 3 or 4 years at that point. So I was happy to leave that era of the world behind. But I was very excited about advancing the world itself a couple of centuries and kind of moving into the kind of there's no characters from Empire of the Wolves that appear in the Great Silence trilogy, for example, apart from some of the supernatural ones, who because they're kind of deathless, sort of demonic or angelic beings. But all of the mortal people are dead, right? So it was very important to me that it was a fresh jumping off. There's no homework required. It's not like the MCU where I'm watching. God, what was it?
All 10 movies that lead up to Endgame kind of thing.
No, not even. Well, so they're fairly. That's. I would almost disagree. I'd say they're fine. I'm okay with those ones. It's more the post that one. It's post. It's that I was watching Mountains of
Madness. Like having to watch WandaVerse.
Right,
before.
exactly that.
Yeah.
I was watching Mountains of Madness on a plane journey recently, and I was like, "What the fuck is going on here?" Like, I feel like I have missed a huge chunk of backstory.
Richard?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't watch WandaVision, Adrian, and so I didn't know what was happening. And I was like, I definitely have missed. It felt like I'd missed the first 20 minutes of the movie, and so you can't do that. Well, yeah, I suppose you can, but you'd be prepared to lose a lot of readers. You I haven't done that because I wanted it to be a fresh. But what I didn't want to do was I got, it's rich. deep world building from Empire of the Wolf. What a shame to not let it go to waste, but what a shame to just kind of leave that there. Like, if I'm going to write a Flintlock series anyway, why not keep the same world and have some fun with the history of the place, and you can get into the kind of, and even the kind of the nomenclature of it. So, for example, when I was writing Grave Empire, and the first thing I did was a map. Right? I did the city of Sova as a map, and I did the world map. And I was like, if you had, so in London, for example, which is a real place, you may have heard of it, they have a place called Micklegate, right? Micklegate, which comes from St. Michael's Gate, but over many years, that's been slowly concatenated and is shortened into Micklegate, right? And I thought that's cool. That's a cool thing. And so when I was writing Empire of the Wolf, in the original series in Sova, there's like the Wolf Gate, the Sun Gate, the Creus Gate, the Victory Gate, the 4 entry points into Sova. And I thought, well, now it's going to be Sungate, or Creus Gate, the Creus Gate magazine, which is a kind of, where they keep all of the powder, obviously, or Wolfgate. So they've concatenated the names. It's a really small thing, but it's a really nice historic world building detail that almost nobody will notice. But for me, it was very satisfying.
But someone will, and they'll be very satisfied.
Exactly. They'll be like, oh yeah. And so
at the same time, like that does allow you to introduce some cool little Easter eggs for the people that can
definitely
pinpoint that stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's the only way to do it. I think ultimately it's got to be Easter eggs. It's got to be things that people will recognize. I'm going to say all this again on the next episode. Things that people will recognize, but that doesn't make anybody feel left out. If they think, well, I haven't read this, so I don't know what's going on. But so no, and I'm looking to, after Great Silence, of course, I'll go another couple of centuries in the future, and it'll be like World War One. Because I have to.
And then eventually, full circle, it'll all just tie into Richard's Sci-Fi.
That's right. Yeah, you know what?
The
number of people who've
writing towards.
I just keep going.
Yeah, Saint Helena's going to be all throughout this time.
That's right. She's coming back.
She's coming back, baby. But I think I really love this Flintlock fantasy kind of area. The first one that I read was Promise of Blood by Brian McClellan.
Sure.
But it's such an interesting sort of historical time frame to draw influence from. Like Napoleonic era, but also in the case of Grave Empire specifically, it's like centuries after the Empire of the Wolf. Obviously you have some Easter eggs and you have kind of the evolution of the world itself. Yeah. But then you also have like Sova feeling very much like Great Britain or Belgium or France or these kinds of European powers during the age of empire and imperialism and colonialism. Why did you choose that as kind of like the era that you wanted to draw inspiration from for this series?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for like a lot of fantasy readers and writers, I'm a sort of bit of a student of history, and I think when you kind of read it, and I read a ton of history nonfiction, and I studied it at school, and I very nearly did a degree in history, but my parents, damn them, dissuaded me from it.
But also law involves a lot of history in and of itself, so you got a little bit there.
It does, yeah, not as much as I would have liked, but
not enough to satisfy me.
It's mostly just law. I love reading about history, and I've always found it really interesting. And I think, and when you do read a lot of history, you get your kind of favorite periods, don't you? And things to read about. And people love to read about like ancient Rome and ancient Greece, or the Second World War, or whatever. And for me, I think I always had the Napoleonic Wars was a huge one for me. I loved that. Great Britain versus France, basically, and so that was a big one for me. And I thought, and of course the medieval period. Everybody loves the medieval period, and I had the Templars as well. Basically everything you read in my books is where I've taken something from history that I find personally really interesting. And so when you look at, like, for example, Empire of the Wolf, you can see the kind of sort of Carolingian Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, and there's the sort of the Templars and the Orders Hospitaller, all that kind of stuff, which I find really interesting. And then now I've kind of moved into what we would call the 7 Years' War. You probably call it the French and Indian War. They're sort of getting into the kind of second half of the Georgian period, towards the kind of American Revolutionary War, Napoleonic Wars. So, and that was another really big kind of historical focus of mine. And I just really enjoy reading about it. I just find it really interesting. And I think this is kind of like you're getting to the point of almost just pre-mechanized warfare where, you think about an infantry, line of infantry getting hit by a cannonball, by like a round shot. And you read some of the primary accounts of that warfare, and it's like, and it's also sanitized, right? Because they're writing in that kind of wonderfully staid kind of 19th century or 18th century style, and it's like, and a cannon was fired obliquely, and 12-pounder, and it carried away 30 men, and you just think, what,
No, those 30 men were literally like torn limb from limb,
blown to bits, right? And you just think, how did anybody do it? And there's all these kinds of accounts. I was sitting at a campfire with my adjutant, and a cannonball came over from the French, and it decapitated him, and blah blah blah, and you just think, my God, let's, like,
just skimming over the details,
just extraordinary, and so this,
like commenting on the weather,
exactly that, and you wonder things like, did those guys suffer like PTSD? Was it just a different generation of people where death was just much closer? Like, I do wonder sometimes whether, in the kind of the pre, before like vaccines and modern medicine and things, when people would just die fairly frequently of almost anything, if you were surrounded by death, and we know the Victorians were totally obsessed with death. Whether if you were surrounded by it, and your siblings were dying and your parents were dying, whatever, whether you were a bit more inured to it. So even if you were a soldier, and the guy behind you gets decapitated by a cannonball, that's obviously horrible. I don't think anybody is going to argue that. But whether you, if you had grown up and like a bunch of people had already just died, whether you may be a bit more kind of. Whereas I, for example, have seen nobody die. Touch wood, I don't really want to either. And so if I saw someone be decapitated by a cannonball, I think that'd probably be quite profoundly affecting. And it's, you get into your head about these sort of questions, and how do these people deal with this? How did you deal with grape shot? In one of the accounts, it was like a sergeant was, the quote was, atomized by grape shot, right? It's like basically a shotgun being fired from a cannon.
Oh my
right?
God,
And it's just this kind of,
what a way to go.
Yeah, well,
atomized is just like there is so
pink
like
dust.
a single, like you were just
mist.
missed.
Yeah.
You were just missed.
Yeah.
So.
That's it. And you think, and so I just find that kind of in its, and this kind of just pre-mechanized warfare, and then you're kind of getting into the American Civil War, where it was even worse, right up to kind of the First World War, where there's like industrial warfare, but still quite outmoded tactics. There's a sort of saying, at the beginning of the First World War, they would have used tactics that Napoleon would have recognized. By the end of the First World War, it would have been what we would recognize in the modern day. And so I think when you're entering, and so there's just something ghoulishly fascinating about, thinking about, I think, Dan Carlin, he does the excellent hardcore history podcast, and he was saying, if you think so, and he said, if you think about if an ancient battle, it's more akin to like 10,000 individual murders, is how he puts it, which is quite a sort of striking turn of phrase. When you're kind of stabbing a guy in front of you and he's dying. Whereas, now modern warfare is kind of like, if you imagine a kind of a jumbo jet plane crash, it's kind of like over a 10-kilometer radius, kind of, it's again, more horrible imagery, but there's something very interesting about that kind of interstitial point where warfare was becoming more mechanized and a bit more industrialized, versus now, where it's gone back to everybody being very far away from each other again, where everything was close up, but also the killing power of weapons was beginning to increase dramatically. I just find something just fascinating about that time period. Yeah, sorry, that was a very long answer.
It's okay, man.
No, but it brings up a really interesting question, though, because obviously there's 3 main point of view characters in this book, and one of them is Peter, who on the surface is a soldier, so you would expect him to be very like restrained and alpha and man's man. And you really subvert that idea quite a bit. So, like, can you talk about Peter's characterization and how and why you decided to kind of subvert that idea?
Yeah, I think Peter. I sometimes wonder whether I think Peter in some ways is kind of like how I would imagine myself in that situation, full of self-doubt. I think Peter's interesting because he's a competent officer and he's a competent soldier, and he's able to. When I was writing Peter, I drew a lot of inspiration from Second World War and Vietnam War writers, and I find that stuff really interesting. So James Jones, Thin Red Line, which is one of my favorite books of all time, and there's a few lines in that book where he's talking about the insanity of basically being prepared to die, as in to end your life permanently forever. To prove to people that you're not afraid of dying, like to prove that you're not a coward to your peers and the soldiers around you. And there's a bit when if you've seen the movie, you might remember it, or even if you read the book, you might remember it. There's a bit when the colonel is ordering them to kind of move up into this. It's set in the Pacific theater of the Second World War, so they're fighting the Japanese on these islands, and they're moving up, and they're getting obliterated by dug-in machine guns and artillery, and so the captain says, "Sorry, everybody stop. This is obviously not working." And the colonel gets on the radio and he's like, "You've got to push up." And he's like, I'm not. We're going to die." And in his kind of internal reflections, this captain's like, it's insane how his fear of bureaucratic reprimand and public humiliation was stronger than his fear of dying. And so it was this kind of, and you read it in some of the Vietnam War writers as well. Like I think Tim O'Brien is one, and they say, I was on the border to Canada and I was going to leave. I was going to flee the United States and desert because I didn't want to be drafted. But ultimately I didn't, because I was worried about people thinking I was afraid. I didn't want to be perceived as a coward. And so I was willing to go and die and be killed to avoid people. And this is this insane disconnect, this idea of, well, surely it's better to be alive, even if people think you are a coward, because once you're dead forever. That's it. And I really wanted to kind of capture that in Peter, where he's internally, he's constantly afraid of people thinking he's not up to the job. And ultimately he was also afraid of being killed. But it's that tension between ultimately the former overrides the latter. And obviously there's a lot of horror happening in that storyline as well, so he has to contend with that. And I think that one of the things I like to do with all my characters, and sometimes I think when people read my characters, they think, oh, they're quite whiny or they're a bit pathetic. And I actually think in a lot of fiction, characters aren't afraid enough. I think a lot of characters are too brave and too unbothered by the things they are presented with. And I think one of the things I like to capture in my characters in their internality is actually this stuff is horrifying, and even leaving aside the actual horror and the demons, etc. Even just fighting a battle, I think, has to be one of the most stressful experiences anybody can endure, and so trying to capture that in Peter's character and make sure that even though I think ultimately he's a good and competent officer and soldier, he's still very frightened, and he's frightened of letting his father down, his family down. He's frightened of what people might think about him if he doesn't do a good job, but he's also frightened of being killed, and he's being sent to a sort of, and he never really wanted to join the army in the first place, and so there's a lot going on with Peter. I think he's a bit of a fan favorite, just because I think he's got an interesting and conflicted character.
Underdog.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I liked Peter, and I was very horrible to him, and that's worse.
This is true.
As well. We have to be horrible to our characters.
Yeah, I really bullied him.
Yeah, but that internality thing that you're talking about is like, people can be afraid of different things. I mean, one of the other main POVs is Renata, who's basically like an ambassador for a culture of mermen, aquatic people, and she's a bureaucratic character, but at the same time, it's kind of like she has this preconceived idea of what it would mean to go and meet the people who she's spent so much of her time invested in and studying and talking about and whatnot. And then there's the actual like experience of going contacting them. And that's fucking terrifying, man. So like, how did you use Renata's POV on the flip side of Peter to kind of show the fear that comes through the unknown and facing the cultural and political dynamics that you have in your head versus the reality in person?
Yeah, it's another great question. I think with Renata, what I wanted to do, and I think ultimately it might switch people off Renata a little bit, but ultimately what I wanted to do was make sure that she wasn't like it would have been super easy, right, to make Renata inject her with our kind of modern sensibilities and say colonialism is bad. Obviously we know colonialism is bad. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. But I wanted to make sure that she was a product of the society she was a part of. And so she is ultimately conflicted because she wants to meet the mer people, the mermen. It's a kind of an academic and professional interest, and so she's kind of obsessed with this. But she is hamstrung by this diplomatic mandate that all Sovan diplomats have, which is that they have to put Sova first in all of their dealings. And ultimately, she is a product of the empire, and she's critical of the empire and its practices. But, I didn't want to, and I wasn't actually going to make it like this kind of horrible, bigoted kind of, Rudyard Kipling kind of character where she kind of, skull measurements and all this kind of stuff, because I think that would have been a mistake for a lot of different reasons. But on the flip side, I wanted to make sure she wasn't like unrealistically above it all. And so professionally, she's hidebound by, her diplomatic and professional mandate. And she wants to be good at her job, and she has his own kind of internal conflict. And then the rubber meets the road, and you're in the ocean. Being in the ocean is quite a frightening thing, right? Like, and I love swimming in the sea. I used to do it a lot in Sydney. And there are sharks in the water there. People do die. It's a couple a year. Not so much in Sydney, but around the sort of different coasts of Australia. So there are fatal attacks every year. And I enjoyed it. And when I was in the water, even though I was only kind of like, I don't know, 20 meters out from the beach, I was like, you're thinking about it. Like it's however unlikely it is, it's always in the back of your mind. And I wanted to try and capture how frightening I think it would be to see a great white shark come up underneath you with its mouth open, and have to sort of trust yourself and your instincts to realize, no, that is a merman shark, that's one of theirs, like, and kind of just stay there.
Remember your sign language.
If anyone wants like a better idea of like what these look like, go check out the Broken Binding social media and go look at the special edition for Richard's Grave Empire, because the art for the mer people is fantastic. It's so good.
I knew, and I said to, when we were doing it, Petring was doing the design, and I said, this merman picture is going to shift so many copies. Like, I know it's going to. But what I really like about that, and because I gave this a lot of thought, right? Because one of the things I really enjoyed getting into the kind of the mer people, the mer culture, and if they had this kind of like equestrian class, right, and they kind of bond with these great white sharks, and if you look at the armor that Jeff Brown did the art, you'll see on the underside of the shark, they have spikes pointing downwards, because great white sharks, they are breach predators. They come up underneath prey. And so the downwards pointing spikes are to dissuade breaching attacks from other sharks. And I thought, damn, that's a cool detail. Which I came up with. So, obviously, I'm praising myself here, but I thought that's a really nice little touch. And he got it in it, and he put it in the picture. I thought that's really cool. Eagle-eyed will see that. But yeah, it's really cool. And so, I think with Renata, I was just like, ultimately, you can have all of this training, but when you get that kind of rubber meets the road moment, and you see the sharks in the water, and you think, and there's a bit also, I think, when there's they're 2 miles out, right? I think it's in their ocean. They're 2 miles out from the shore, and I thought that in itself would be frightening. If you were just kind of bobbing amongst the waves, and there's a long way to shore. You can't swim it, really.
No.
You're totally at the mercy. No. You're totally at the mercy of these creatures. So I really wanted to capture with her that unsettle. It's a bit like, in a very minor way. When you go, if you've traveled a lot, and you'll go to a country, say, for example, that's got a very different culture and a very different infrastructure. So you'll go to, say, for example, Vietnam, or Laos, or Cambodia, or whatever, where there isn't a lot of Western amenities and comforts. And for those first few days, you're a bit kind of out of sorts, and you're you're still finding your feet and getting used to it, and it feels like a very alien place and a very alien culture, especially if you're doing it as a young person. And I wanted to capture that kind of feeling of, and you get used to it, right? And then you spend a couple of days there, and then you start having a great time. And I wanted to capture that unease and that sort of sense of, I'm unsettled here. I'm literally out of my depth, very much out of my literal depth. But also, I feel like, despite all this training, and now that I'm here, I'm in over my head, literally again. So many marine puns.
You've been saving those up, haven't you?
Yeah.
Riding away.
Well, speaking of the stuff of literal nightmares, can you give us a little tease about what the Great Silence actually is?
You know what, they do talk about it in the first book, and I think I don't want to spoil it.
They kind of talk around it a lot because it seems like they don't really have a great idea of what it is or what it means.
It's difficult to talk about without spoiling. I think in the book they opine that it's the destruction of every living, or not living, because obviously it's in the afterlife, so very much dead, the opposite of living. It's the destruction of every spiritual force in the afterlife, or certainly their disappearance. And what causes that does, that does happen at the end of book one, or they realize what it is. And I loved writing that. It was just something so horrible about it. And I think I've had the idea for that for a long time, and I've expressed it in a lot of different novels in a lot of different ways. But it's the first time I've done it in a kind of fantasy setting. But yeah, it's difficult to sort of, because it's the biggest spoiler of the book. Yeah. So I probably shouldn't talk about it. But
spoiler, it's atheism. No, I'm just kidding.
I had this idea actually for the kind of, in the third trilogy, the story would be that they just got so sick of all this afterlife stuff that they would just try and find a way to just excise the planet from the whole thing, and just literally become there's no afterlife anymore. We're done with this. It's too horrible.
And that's how AI gets introduced into the world.
The beginning of Richard's Sci-Fi.
That's right. The machines then come.
Oh my god, brilliant, buddy. Well, closing out, I'm going to ask you a two-parter. Okay. If you can give listeners and viewers a good bit of soundbite writing advice, and B, tell us a weird or random fact that you find to be utterly fascinating.
Oh man, a good piece of writing advice is, I do have a good piece of writing advice. I normally say that the only actually correct piece of writing advice is to read a lot and write a lot. And I think reading all the time and broadly, and writing all the time are the only ways to improve as a writer. But the piece of advice I've been giving more recently is do the thing that makes your book interesting and unique, because there are so many books now, and there are so many books being published every year, and a lot of them are very similar. And I think if there's anything that makes you so for example, the Justice of Kings, obviously it was lawyers, right? It was fantasy lawyers, fantasy legal. And so I was thinking, I'm going to lean into that, and I'm going to talk about law, and I'm going to do jurisprudence, and I'm going to theorize about it. And that was the hook that got me over the line. And with this new series, I sort of, obviously it's about diplomacy and international relations. So yeah, I spent a chapter just talking about diplomatic theory, and I thought, just do the thing. If there's a point you're making in the book, do it and lean into it, because if it's the thing that makes it unique, that's what's going to make it stand out ultimately. Don't just write a generic fantasy, even if it's really well done, because these days it's not enough. It's got to be interesting. But apart from that, I always hated the advice show don't tell. I always hated it. I think it's just a terrible piece of. I get it. I understand why that advice exists, and it's not always bad. But I feel like a lot of the conventional writing wisdom that things like that, which sounds sensible and great and pithy, and actually, just tell the story. You don't have to show everything. You can just tell bits. It's like
show and tell.
Yeah,
in the right in the right balance.
In the right balance.
Yeah, but sometimes you'll read a book and this is I'm reading you read an older book, right? So I read Desolation Island recently, which is a Patrick O'Brian novel in the Aubrey Maturin series. If you're not familiar with it, it's about Napoleonic maritime sailors, sea combat, naval combat. Really, really good, really famous. And Master and Commander is based on one of his books, and there's a bit in it when he's just like, and now I'm just going to tell you about sailing. And it's just, a chapter of it. And it's just like, this is cool. But this is cool. I'm enjoying this. And the book also just ends. There's no real structure to the novel. Stuff just happens and then it ends. And I read this book and I was like, this book would not be published now, because it conforms to none of the standard kind of writing advice. And I think especially when you get into older books, you will see how much they violate these supposed rules. So anyway, my advice is disregard all of the rules and just write a really interesting book.
All the rules except read and write.
Except read and write. That's the cardinal rule. Yeah. Yeah, no, you do have to do that. You got to do that.
Well, now give us something weird or random.
God damn. This is like one of those tell us an interesting fact about yourself at the corporate away day. Something weird or random. Yeah, I should have looked this up before you asked me. There's going to be a long silence.
The Great Silence by Richard Swan.
As I desperately think, what did I learn about? I must have learned an interesting fact when I was doing some research for my books. Oh, biphasic sleep was an interesting one. Did you know that in the medieval period, it was quite common to go to bed for a few hours, wake up for an hour or two, and either read or pray, and then go back to bed? And that was like a totally normal thing that people did. Like they used to sleep in 2 chunks and wake up in the middle of it. That was
I've been learning a lot about sleep lately. Mostly because of my kids being shitty sleepers
and not sleeping.
Not sleeping. But yeah, it has to do with the natural rhythms of the body, and it's, by doing that, you're not actually ruining your sleep because of the ways in which your sleep cycles function, regardless of whether you wake up or not.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's actually like it used to be a super common. We don't do it now, but that used to be like a very normal way that people.
I'm going to start doing that. Just spend an hour writing in the middle of the night and then just go back to sleep.
Yeah. I wouldn't recommend that.
I mean, with young kids, it's it might be your only shot.
Well, on that positive parenting note, Richard, thank you so much for chatting with me today. Can you please let everyone know where they can find you online?
Yeah, sure. I'm on Twitter, Richard_S_Swan. I'm on Instagram as Richard Swan Author. I'm on Blue Sky as I'm not even sure. I think Richard Swan Author are there as well. And then I've got a website which is stonetemplelibrary.com.
Still the best author website I've ever seen.
Thanks, man.
And go pick up Richard's books. You got The Justice of Kings and the Empire of the Wolf trilogy. Grave Empire is going to be out very soon after this episode, I think next week, February 4th.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
Then, at least, I'm not sure. February 4th in the US and probably like a few days later in the UK because of...
Yeah, they do that, yeah.
Whatever weird shit.
Or something.
Yeah.
I don't know why, man.
Some weird shit. Or if you're in for some sci-fi, then go check out his self-pub trilogy, The Art of War, as well. And you can follow SFF Addicts on Instagram, Twitter, all those platforms at SFF Addicts Pod. You can follow me at Adrian M Gibson. You can get Mushroom Blues if you want some fungi in your life. And Greta, what about you?
Yeah, I'm on all the things at Greta K. Kelly, and go check out the Queen of Days if you want to find out what it would be like if your D&D party fought a fallen god with nothing but unearned confidence and banter.
Which is this podcast in a nutshell. All right, well, that's it for this episode. Stay tuned next week for part 2 with Richard, where we're going to be doing a mini-masterclass on how to create a shared universe. For now, keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see you next time on SFF Addicts.